Yes. Is a hit U of T time? Good time to start. So I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to the very first ever Not Quite a talk organized by Not Quite a Lecture. Today we have Professor Thywissen talking about effective science communication and scientific presentations. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm going to give you a talk based on slides that were originally created for a course called Effective Communication for Scientists, PHY 1600. And so the idea of this talk is to working good. So I'm going to tell you about giving a talk and some critical errors you might make. And the purpose of the talk is not just to tell you about that, but also to make you start thinking about criticizing talks. And kind of like when you're writing, once you become a good editor, then you can become a better writer. And it's kind of like reinforced learning cycle, right? So I'm going to talk about first what are the necessary ingredients of giving a talk, compare presenting to writing. There's some similarities, some differences, and then go through the stylistic elements of presenting, talking in each category about critical errors, common mistakes, and how you can do better. The primary reference, especially for this last part here, is a book called The Craft of Scientific Presentations by Michael Alley. So a good talk has three necessary ingredients. One of them is content. You have some information you want to convey, and you're interested to do that and to engage the audience. Okay, and the next thing is part of what you're delivering to any audience is your passion, your interest in the topic. And if you think in your mind about lectures that you've really been inspired by versus lectures you haven't been inspired by, a huge way to decide is whether they conveyed some kind of excitement about the topic they were discussing. So that's another ingredient you're carrying into the room when you're presenting. A third thing that you need to know is who your audience is. And the more you know your audience, the better talk you're able to give. And that's because you can change parts of your talk and how you present it to start at the right level for your audience and then build them into a different place. You know the talk has been a success if your audience understands what you said, if they're convinced by anything you say that might have been controversial, and then they remember the presentation the next day. Okay, so those are your goals for a successful talk. Now, in some ways, giving a talk is kind of like writing a research article if it's a scientific talk. It has a structure which is clear. It has an introduction, it has sections, categories, and it has conclusions, much like writing a good paper. So the introduction should say what, why, what is the work? Why is it important? What's the context of your work? What was done previously? What you're doing further? So especially if you're talking about your research, placing yourself within the literature is an important part of beginning. And then how will it be presented? So that's the kind of in this work we sentence where you say, in this talk, I am going to tell you X. The body of a talk or a paper is to go through and now get into the details of what you want to say. In a sense, you can think about this like a path. You want to take your audience on a journey, and the sections of your talk are the path you want to take them on. And it's helpful to let them know where they are. So sometimes people will have at the top of their talk, sections and how many slides you're in, or page numbers, or some kind of reference. So people shouldn't be lost in the middle of your talk. And then finally, at the end, you want to summarize. You want to restate what was done, give you conclusions, and then look forward to the future about how you go from what was discussed today to the future. All of those things are very similar to a paper. There are some differences, though. if we just kind of think about what it is to read an article is a kind of random access thing. You can flip back and forth. You can decide when you pick it up, when you stop. In a talk, you have a very specific time frame. As I'm going through these slides, you cannot go backwards in time. All right. A written article is often aimed to a set of individuals who are kind of understanding what you're doing alone, whereas an audience has a kind of interaction and a collective aspect to it, which could be important. Another thing is that the pacing of a written article is self-paced. So if there's something you don't understand, you can kind of pause, think about it, let it kind of sink in. Whereas in a talk, if you go too quickly, you can lose people. They can't slow you down, and so you need to think about pacing in the time frame. Another thing about the time frame is that we have 1 hour today. I probably won't talk for an hour, but the paper has no time limit to it. There's some nice things about a presentation. I can use video, which is often not used in articles, although more and more I think it is. And then finally, you can be interactive in a presentation. I would say this is the most special thing about giving a talk. If you travel to a conference or you travel to another location and your audience has no interaction with you, it's just all passive transmission, you might leave wondering, why did I even go? Because we had that live interaction possibility and it wasn't used. Whereas a written article is very passive. There's no reaction usually to written comments. Okay, so now let's go further into the presentation, and the stylistic tools that you use in your presentation will determine its success. So I'm going to break up these stylistic tools into the words you use, speech, the strategy you choose, which is structure, visual aids, slides, how you use them, and then some aspects of delivery. Okay, so first of all, about speech. 2 things you want to avoid are giving the wrong talk or boring your audience. So giving the wrong talk might mean either you use diction that is unclear or scientific buzzwords that are not known to your audience, or you talk too long. That's also giving the wrong talk. Someone expects a half-hour talk, you give them an hour-and-a-half talk. Another thing is boring your audience. You don't want to read from the slides. I'm kind of reading some slides here, so you be critical of that. And you can also bring in something that's a little more lively than just words on a page. You can make it personal. So at the beginning, I said to you, this is a talk I created for this class. And you probably remembered that very easily compared to a lot of these things that are just flashing up on the screen. So another thing you can do is add some humor. That can always get people going, crack a joke. Be careful, the wrong joke can really turn away the audience and communicate the wrong message. Okay, so now structure. Structure is what am I going to put in my talk? And a huge mistake that you make is trying to cover too much. So if you try to cover too much, then you end up going fast. And unfortunately, when you go to our colloquia in the department, you often see this happen, that a bad talk is someone who has to accelerate at the end and just go skip, 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 right? So so don't try to cover too much. Think about that. Also, you need to start in the right place and lead your audience on that path. So you don't want to lose them on the trail, and you want to start where they are. And then finally, if you're talking about something controversial, you might have a biased audience. Are you going to have to convince people of something? And if you are going to have to convince them, do you know where they're starting? And so this is probably more important for, let's say, non-objective scientific stuff. But sometimes even for scientific stuff, it can get pretty controversial. So you need to know in advance if your audience is starting out as a skeptic to the topic you're gonna present, or would be surprised by the results you're gonna present, or if the audience really knows and already agrees with what you're gonna say from the start, and so the talk is about something else, not convincing people, but rather, let's say, teaching them something that's uncontroversial. Okay, So I'd say one of the biggest of all these things, really trying to cover too much is the challenge of making a research talk. And so let's talk about that. I mean, you want to cover the material, but you have a limited attention span and a limited amount of time. And so you're always balancing those two things. If you're giving a research talk at a conference, you might have like 10 minutes to give your talk. And then you've like been working for a year and you have 10 minutes to talk about your year. It's a little disappointing. And so there would be a lot of tension between those. And this is really a fatal flaw for so many talks. You try to be too detailed, or you try to cover too much, or maybe you try to cover too much in a too detailed way, right? And then it fails as a talk. And it could fail because you designed it in a way that was never going to work, or you designed it without remembering that a talk is an interactive thing, and so people can stop you and ask a question. A really hilarious example of that is someone who is giving a talk for a qualifying exam, and they had like many slides prepared, but they got to like slide 2, and then they talked about that for an hour because slide 2 had something that was really controversial on it. So you might anticipate that you're going to get derailed by questions. Okay. So how do you deal with that? How do you figure out what to do about the scope? So the first thing is to know, of course, the time and the audience. But really, I think the key is practice and iterate. And so if you're making your talk at the last moment, just the night before or the day before, then if you choose the scope wrong and you give the talk, that's it. But if instead you tell your lab mates or your friends, look, I'm going to give a talk and I need to practice, I need to run through it. So you set a time and you have like an early deadline. You're going to be standing in front of people and you're going to go through the talk. And then in a group like this, you get some feedback. One of the feedback might be, you started 2 hours ago and we're still here, right? So that's one thing. Another thing, which is something I do a lot, is I have a strategy for skipping material. Because what I'm really hoping is I go to a conference, let's say, or I'm going to an audience, and I do get stopped with questions, and we have an engaging conversation. And now that time I thought I had, 35 minutes or whatever, becomes 20 minutes for the rest of my talk. So what am I going to do? If I went into the talk knowing that, okay, the third part of the talk I can pretty much skip, or the middle part of the talk is not really the essential thing, I already know what I'm going to drop. And when you skip something, do not fast forward and show every slide. So in almost every PowerPoint or Keynote interface, you can just type a number and you can jump directly to a new slide. And so you could write down for yourself, or just in your presenter notes, check the time. If you only have 20 minutes left, go to slide 13 or something like that, and then you just know what to do. So that's a well-rehearsed talk. Like, you have skip points that go forward, so that then when you're presenting those slides, you're not doing it at 2x speed. You're actually giving the information at a pace that can be understood, because you've designed in advance what you're going to skip. This all takes time. Like everything I've just said to you about like knowing what to skip and getting your friends together and getting feedback and deciding what the essence of your talk is, you're never going to be able to do that if you don't leave the time to do it. And so a good talk is only one that has had sufficient preparation time. So what does that mean? You need to start a few weeks in advance. You kind of need to know how quickly you go through slides, and by practicing, you'll get an idea of that. And some of the thing you might do when you're cutting your talk, when someone says, that was really too long, is you take those carefully prepared slides or that content you were thinking and just put it in backup in case someone asks you or wants to discuss afterwards. Okay, so this is the thing. Visual aids are the thing that most people are thinking about when they're making their talk. They're not thinking about diction and the elements I just mentioned to you so much. They're thinking, oh, I have to go make my slides. That's what people say when they're going to go work on their talk. So let's talk about slides. I have some slides about slides. And a big problem is that you boot up your PowerPoint and you just use the defaults from Microsoft. And I don't really know who made those, but they're awful. Okay, so let's talk about what's wrong with them. So there's the person who really hates Microsoft Word is named Edward Tufte. He's a guru about presenting information. And so he wrote this article called "PowerPoint is Evil," and says, remember, the speaker is making PowerPoints, and they're using bullets. You know, this is a war and domination analogy, right? The metaphor is too accurate. It's an evil thing, okay? And they look nice. Like if you look at a slide, it looks very geometrical and pretty, but it isn't really good for the audience. And part of the reason is that it encourages you to fragment and phrase out every idea and turn it into buzziness, okay? Sentences are actually a nice way to communicate. If someone reads something, they're often looking for sentences. Another thing is it's information poor, and so if what you're going to do is just read your slides, and then you get about 8 seconds of reading material on every slide, which is about 40 words. So then if you're just like reading your slides and clicking through PowerPoint, it's a really fast rate. It's very numbing. And so what happens when you see most bulleted presentations, it might be happening to you now because I'm using a lot of bullets, is that like at the beginning you're following the thread, but eventually you just get numbed out by too many bullets and not enough visual information. And so really what your slide should be is not what I've done here, but a lot more visual. So here's an example. Is this an effective visual aid? Imagine someone is presenting a slide to you and they call it, you know, they have a buzzy title, they have a whole bunch of bullets, and then they go through this thing, okay? And the idea of making a good slide is you turn this into a visual information processing. So this thing could also be this, okay? A digital acquisition system samples at a rate high enough to preserve the signal of the shape of the analog signal. That's a sentence. So you write up one sentence, and then you present the evidence, the visual evidence that follows that assertion. And this has a flow behind it. So it shows you that there's a measurement device, you know, an A to D converter, etc. And that says, by the way, all the same things that this said. Okay, you have an accelerometer, an analog voltage is produced, it had a sinusoidal shape. All of those words are just that, right? The analog signal is converted to a digital signal, it's sampled at a specific rate, and the rate has to be high enough to retain the analog shape, okay? That was the original assertion. That's the whole point of this slide, is sampling. And look here, you have a shape, and you can see that the samples have captured the shape. So you've turned something that was just a set of bullets into some visual information, and you, since you have a voice, can articulate all of those words. The words you say do not need to be on your slide. Instead, the slide accompanies you, and it helps the audience. So this is the essence of what I want to tell you about making slides, which is don't PowerPoint out what could be a visual aid. So what are some good formatting suggestions? Write a headline. Use the area of your slide for visual information, and think about the layout that kind of narrates a story. And that's the challenge in making a good slide. So, you know, the PowerPoint defaults are like title, bullet, 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 or title, bullet, 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 and a tiny little, you know, part for graphics. And standard advice is blow all that away and use most of your slide for the graphic and just a little bit of space at the top for the assertion, for the main point in sentence form of what you want to communicate. So this slide is actually a good example of a slide. Use the slide layout to provide supporting visual evidence. And then here's the visual that supports this Another example of that is, okay, here's PowerPointified stuff. How the MRI process begins. Atoms have spin, which normally point in random directions. Here's a little graphic. The MRI patient is placed in a strong magnetic field, so spins align. Here's some line, gradients, and counter, so there's a lot of words here. But you really don't need all those words. You can just say those words and instead be standing in front of this. The magnet's field causes the spins to align, graphic. Or applied RF waves add energy, graphic. So you use the space for a nice visual. Okay. Here's another example, which is historic, which is that this table was sent to the decision makers at NASA before the Challenger was launched and exploded. And so the title of this was History of O-ring Damage on SRM Field Joints. And then there's a whole bunch of data, okay? By the way, this data, if you just did this, said the lower the launch temperature is, the more likely the erosion of the O-ring occurs. Here's temperature, and then here's O-ring damage index going up as temperature goes down. And this was the temperature the day that ship was launched, right? So assertion evidence is a compelling story and sometimes critical. What I've just described to you is something called the assertion evidence approach. It's a particular style of making slides. That a one-sentence assertion is at the top, and you use the field of the slide for visual evidence. There's a whole bunch of other accepted, studied approaches. One of them you probably know well is a TED Talk. Okay, and a TED Talk uses huge graphics, no words, and the rehearsed level of the presenter is amazing. And you're just looking at them and they are speaking. You really don't use the slide for words at all. There's other approaches that you can read about. A crazy one is called Pechakucha. Okay, and the idea is that you have to use 20 slides and that the slides are on auto timer, 20 seconds per slide. And I guess the idea there is to be succinct and fast and lively. So if you've seen Pechakucha, it's a certain style. And then there's like even further, like more or less doing a movie, so I've never done that, but those are two well-known slide styles. And yeah, here's some examples of TED Talks. The presenter may put up an image like this, which is a compelling image. It's their narrative in front of the slide, which is telling you the story, and this is just some kind of following this. Or here's someone giving a TED Talk, they're speaking, you're looking at them, and there's one sentence, with a visual. It's a little more like assertion evidence. Okay, so that's about visual aids. And let me now get to the last stylistic element, which is about delivery. Yeah, I guess these are other, critical errors. Not preparing enough. We kind of talked about that also, drawing words in the wrong well. Paying attention means kind of looking at your audience and seeing what's happened, trying to figure out what the feedback is going, how the feedback is going. And then the last thing is losing composure. Okay, what happens if I get really nervous? And so that's also something to practice. People who have acted on stage or given presentations thousands of times still get nervous right beforehand. And so you kind of have to live with that and learn that that's okay and not let it spiral. Like, oh no, I'm nervous. Oh no, I'm really nervous that I'm nervous now. Oh no, I'm more nervous now that I'm nervous now. Okay, and also there's some kind of adaptation. So if what's nerve-wracking to you is actually looking at someone and the fact that they're looking at you is stressing you out, some people have this technique where they look at like the exit row, like right above the last row. So they're not actually, they're avoiding eye contact for people if it makes you stressed out. Another thing you can do when losing composure is kind of stop and take a breath. Okay. Not said here, but part of stopping and taking a breath is if you really want to emphasize something, pause and say nothing right afterwards. It's very effective. If you learn to be comfortable enough in presenting that you don't fill the whole space with noise, but you allow there to be silence, it's a very powerful presenting tool. Okay, so finally, there's a kind of collection of advice that didn't really fit into any of these categories, and I can just let you read some of these. One piece of advice I haven't mentioned is don't just say thank you on your last slide. Use the final slide for information. Take a breath, pause when you need to. Avoiding fillers is very difficult. I've ummed right in front of you this whole time, and I've been thinking about it a little bit, but when you don't think about it, you start umming again. So that's something you need to practice. Instead of umming and awing and liking and meaning and all this stuff, you can just pause, and that's more effective. Let's see, another standard advice that you've probably heard before is when you're going to show a graph, a scientific graph with two axes, the first thing you do is you say, this graph shows you the magnitude of the signal versus temperature, something like that. I didn't do that when I showed you that Challenger disaster. Did I? Yeah, I did. No, I did. I told you what the two axes were. Yeah. So part of the reason you do that is to remind yourself that the audience is seeing that graph for the first time, and so they aren't going to be familiar with what information is being presented. It slows you down a little bit to start to describe what the axes are. And then it also launches you into a narrative describing the takeaway message from a graph. About the quirks that we all have when we're put in front of an audience. An amazing thing is to have someone film you or see a film of yourself giving a presentation. You'll be amazed at the things you do. You know, when put in front of an audience, you might, sway back and forth, or you might, always be doing the same hand motion, or, you want to be aware as much as you can about repetitive motions that may annoy your audience. And you just do it. We will all do that until you learn not to. Okay, so with all this, I want to say you can become a great presenter. Practice, think about these things, engage your critical, you're all physicists, so you know how to criticize and think critically. Engage that kind of critical faculty to communication of all kinds, writing and presenting, and you'll just get better and better. There's a lot written about this. A lot of these ideas have been drawn from standard texts. So you can also pick up and kind of breeze through this standard texts on scientific presenting, and another way to improve. Thanks for your attention.
Question portion of the evening. Do we have any questions? People on Zoom as well. Okay, I guess I'll start with a question then. You just mentioned that there's some standard literature that we could read. Do you have any personal favorites or examples?
Yeah. Go. change something. Where people just naturally stay in there. Yeah.
This is more of a question about what would you present if you're presenting to an audience that maybe knows more than you. I don't know, like say you're an undergrad and you're presenting. They probably know more than you at that point. So how do you go about that?
Yeah, it's also something when you go to a conference. You're often going to a conference with the top researchers in your field, and then there are parallel talks. So the people who show up to your session in particular may actually be within that community, the specialists. And so there you are standing in front of a room of, some of the best people in the world if you're going to a good conference. The first thing to remember is never underestimate the pleasure of hearing something you understand. So when presenting a topic, if you explain something well that the person who's listening to you already knew, they will be enjoying. And now the whole talk is like that. Their attention may wander, but I think as educators, we're often thinking about how to explain things. And so even if the content is something someone is an expert in, the way you explain it is new. Your path to understanding it, the words you use, the visuals you use, can be completely new, even to someone who's been working on this for the last decade. And so don't cut the material. I think you've got two audiences in mind. You have some people in the room who need the introduction, and then there are the other people in the room maybe who know what you're saying. But if you're explaining something well, they're both going to be engaged. And yeah, the pleasure of understanding something of hearing something you understand already and hearing that explained is really fantastic, actually. If you think about your own experience in colloquia or research talks, in the introduction where you're hearing like classics of things that, really neat stuff that you already know, but you're hearing about it again, you're like, yeah, I like this stuff. And oh, that's a nice way of saying it.
So how much of this would you say is applicable? How much would you apply to
It really depends on the level of the lecture. So I'd say a question to ask yourself is, how much of an entertainer do you need to be? And how much, so if I'm teaching a graduate course, I often think that the content itself is enough entertainment to keep people pretty interested. But if I'm teaching a first-year physics course, I'm thinking I kind of need to make it a little more lively because the content itself may not be as engaging to the audience. Maybe because in a lot of first-year courses, you're hearing a repetition of something you've heard in high school. But also maybe people are just motivated differently at that point. It's not as challenging or something. So I kind of feel like it depends tremendously on the audience. You know that there's a lot of research about interactive learning and clickers and this kind of stuff. And that research shows that it especially helps in first year in big classes to keep it lively, to keep it interactive, maybe relevant to your question. But not that there's much of a gain at a high-level course. In fact, what happens in high-level courses if you build in too much of this clicker kind of content is that you dilute the material in a way that actually leaves people less satisfied with the course. Because I think people want to come and have as much time as possible going through the concepts and maybe discussing them as a class, but not interactively. So Yeah, I would say the assertion, evidence, and how to build a good slide, those kind of things you can apply to lectures quite a bit. The slides you make should not be bullet parties. You know, they should be visual. And then if you want to say something, say it. Or you want to write something, write it live. But a lot of static bullet content is not going to make a good lecture. But visual aids are great. Some of the other aspects of that I was talking about here do apply. Like, you know, make sure you start at the right level and have a path, which is people don't get lost at. I'd say that applies to a class. Some of this stuff does apply for both.
There's a question online. So thank you for your talk. What would you recommend for someone who is not delving deep enough and maybe have too broad of a topic that they need to cover?
Not delving. I don't understand.
I think their question is like if the topic that you need to present on is too broad and you can't really dive deep in on anything. So what would your advice be for presentations with that kind of requirement?
Well, I guess you want to tell people how to dig in more deeply. For instance, you could make sure people have references or follow up with your own detailed notes. So sometimes if you're lecturing, for instance, you're like, oh, going from step A to B is very intricate. I'm just going to post a note on that. And that allows you to maybe cover more topics and then motivate a follow-up later on. Yeah, so providing further resources probably be my first thought about that. I mean, another thing is if it's so broad you can't really give a satisfying level of explanation, maybe you need to cut the scope. Maybe it's too broad.
Thank you from Zoom.
Yeah, any other online? So I'm not seeing the chat here. Yeah.
So when you said that, what do you replace it
Yeah, okay. So how do you best use your presenting position and motion? I would say one style is you're standing at a podium and you're just totally static. Sometimes you need to do that because you're microphoned at the podium or you're in a camera that's not going to follow you around. But if you're going to move, then yeah, I suppose you should be aware of things you do too much. In this talk, for instance, maybe what I did a little too much was, you know, I had my pointer and I would like point to this and say something and point to this and say something. Like I just did that over and over again. And it probably didn't enhance my presentation. If I had instead only pointed to 5 things, you would have really noticed each of those. With laser pointers, what you sometimes see people do is they turn and they like zit, 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 like the laser pointer is always going, right? You know, it's always moving. And there's this idea that if I keep moving the laser pointer, then maybe the cat is going to like follow the laser pointer. And it doesn't really help communicate. Eventually, when you're watching the laser pointer like loop and loop and loop on the screen, as an audience member, you're just like, what? This is annoying. Like, stop it. But as a presenter, that person is just nervous. Like they're really trying to communicate and they're putting energy into looping the laser pointer, right? And it's a little misplaced, but that's what they're trying to do. So becoming aware of those things can help you stop. Because if you had a conversation with that person, they'd be like, oh yeah, I shouldn't have done that. That was probably annoying, wasn't it? You know, like it doesn't take much, but there needs to be some kind of feedback. Yeah. try to have a natural stance. Try not to be too try to telegraph your openness. So you don't want to stand like this, right? You don't want to turn away from the audience and just talk to your slide the whole time. Like that just means I don't care about you. So when you're choosing each of those things, you're giving a message, and be aware of those.
I'd say maybe a lot of these things you could practice in front of a mirror, and some mannerisms you can just notice, oh, this doesn't seem to work, and then kind of just live looking at yourself, try and figure out, okay, what should I do instead?
I've never
Something
found
like that.
mannerisms something I can debug in front of the mirror, because I think I need to be nervous before I launch into them.
Oh,
And so the audience is, in a sense, like the being on stage is kind of what provokes it. What I do find is that I can rehearse really effectively the first sentence I'm going to say in every slide. And so if I'm really concerned about time, then what I'll do in my research talks that I'm going to give to a big audience is, after constructing the talk, I will type out in its entirety the first sentence I'm going to say on the slide. And then you can practice that, and that really works to do alone in your room. Right now, when I'm presenting, I have this dual slide thing going, so I have presenter notes. Notice it's empty. I didn't do that here. But you can use that space because you have that prompt in front of you. I find that after you've written out that first sentence for every slide, you don't need to read it, because you actually just pretty much memorize it as you do. But if you your mind goes blank because you're nervous and you go to your next slide, what you don't want to say is, so in this slide, what was I going to say here? Oh yeah, in this slide, it'd be better to just be silent, look down at your notes, see the first thing you're going to say, and read it. Actually, this brings up another thing. Some people write out what they're going to say in a presentation and read what they've written. What do you think about that?
you end up probably going too fast when you do that. Then you're not thinking yourself what you're going to say next. Rather, you're just kind of going off the script. You might not catch that you're losing the audience.
Yeah, it's very static. I'd say you can tell, unless someone's a real pro, you can tell when they're doing that. Now, a TED Talk is saying exactly what someone prepared. There's no part of those talks which are spontaneous. If you haven't seen this video, there's a TED Talk about preparing a TED Talk. And it's a hilarious talk about procrastination. And so the person giving the talk, it's hilarious. It's one of the highly watched TED Talks. The person is talking about a level of preparation that you go through. Like, one of them is that you kind of know what you want to say. And then another level of presentation is you know exactly what you want to say. And then another one is you could say your talk backwards, and so TED Talks are super rehearsed, so that when you're giving that delivery, you don't have to read it or kind of stumble through it. You actually know your lines, and you can get back in the mode of communicating with your audience. You're saying it and pacing it in a way that's natural, but to a script that you already know. So it can be good. It can be great, in fact. But the level of work we're talking about now is up by an order of magnitude or two. And actors on stage, they're not ad-libbing most of the time, not like comedy houses do. But mostly they're saying something that's very well scripted. So it can be good. I also think I've been noticing, I've often thought it's really cheesy to read something you've written in advance, but I've been noticing myself being fairly uncritical of someone who does that, because sometimes when spoken remarks are read, they're also very well chosen language, and someone may say something that's significant or beautiful, even if the delivery isn't that engaging in itself. So it's one way to go. If you're nervous and you're going to give an introduction to someone, for instance, often that's the right way to go.
Perfectly timed.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. One more round of applause for Professor Thywissen. Thank you. Right. And hopefully this inspires more people to sign up for the Not Quite a Lecture program in the next season now that we all know what to do. Thank you.